What's up, y'all? It's your girl, Changa. Thanks for tuning in. First things first, make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel and be sure to turn on notifications so that you don't miss out on any of my new content. Let's get it rolling. So, the insurrection, the Capitol insurrection that took place almost 3 months ago, it feels both like it was a long time ago and also like it was pretty recent. And I think that's what happens with events of that magnitude that ultimately try to hijack democracy as we know it. So the Capitol insurrection that took place on January 6th was encouraged by the former holder of the presidency at that time, and also perpetrated by white delusionists from all across the U.S. and just kind of descended on the Capitol that day. There were members of Congress and their families there at the time, along with employees who were all almost murdered or killed during this insurrection when, the white delusionists were able to enter the building because security and police numbers were questionably low, and the resistance that they were met with was also questionable and a little light. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as most people know her as AOC, was one of the members that was there at that time. And it was about 8 weeks ago. She had taken some time off of social media to deal with the trauma of what occurred to her and her fellow colleagues. But when she did return to social media, she had a very vulnerable and revealing video where she kind of went into what she experienced along with some of her colleagues, and also opening up about an experience of her past, which I thought was very brave, very bold, and unexpected. And I appreciate her honesty and transparency and vulnerability on top of what was already a vulnerable and healing and traumatic time for her. Essentially, these white delusionists, part of this insurrection, were attempting to burn down democracy in the name of white supremacy, in the name of, similar to the Civil War, where they were losers and didn't want to stand for it. So they, utilized violence and treasonous tactics that if anyone else were to do it, they'd be the first people to, call them out. But when it was their president, their white supremacy, their racism, their, inability to keep blacks from voting, or inability to take away the rights of immigrants, they stormed the Capitol, like the place of where, you see democracy in action. You see them meeting, you see them going over votes and getting ready to inaugurate a new president who was voted in by the American people in an election that was the staple of democracy. And there was no voter fraud. There was never any proof of that. As much as they tried to sue and to counter protest any of that, that did not take place. And so this act of insurrection, this act of a coup, just goes to show that white supremacy is the overall issue that this country will always face. And because so many people opt to turn a blind eye or call it something that it's not, we still encounter situations and events like this. And the thing that's different about this is that because it was solely white supremacist or white delusionist, and it was against pretty much majority other white people, it really took us, made people's heads spin when watching this, because the reaction people have to domestic terrorists who are white who commit mass shootings is very different from those of a Middle Eastern or those of a marginalized group, who happens to have a gun or happens to, do something that's violent. And most of the times they don't walk away with their lives. But as you see, most white mass shooters are able to be given a trial. their rights are upheld. So that's why the response to the insurrection has really opened a lot of people's eyes, because they saw firsthand the lack of, police counters, just the ability for them to go on to work the next day. Obviously, I think it's the FBI that has been, opening up cases on these rioters who ultimately had their faces completely clear on cameras and pictures, or just posted to their social media in a sense of pride and joy to be taking part in this just anti-American act. But that even still has taken time, and you'll see some of them that are now on the no-fly list having a complete childish temper tantrum and just break down in airports as though they completely thought their privilege was going to maintain them and protect them. And that's why the act of losing any sort of rights after doing something so anti-American is throwing them for a loop. But I digress a bit, because the point of this video was to highlight AOC and the revelation of her traumatic experience. So ultimately, what she revealed was that she was in her office with one of her staffers, and someone barged into her office, and she was hiding behind, some of the internal, other rooms behind a door, and could see through the hinge crack, and could see, and it was this angry, violent rioter just screaming, where is she, to what she wholeheartedly believed was going to be her last few moments on this earth. And I mean, it was just heartbreaking to watch and listen, because I can't even imagine being in a moment that's playing out. Like, time there was no sense of time any longer for her. She doesn't know if it was a few seconds, a few minutes. It just, to be that aware of your mortality that could be taken, I can't even imagine. And my heart breaks for her. But ultimately, she then heard the voice of her staffer, but then also heard the voice of a Capitol Police officer who she said had this disposition of just anger and hostility. And her staffer couldn't tell, she couldn't tell whether this was going to be a situation that escalated into more violence or not, because the Capitol Police officer didn't identify himself, didn't escort them to another safer spot. He basically just shouted out orders for them to go to this other building. And so, they just ran out, because that situation could have turned violent. Who knows? So, what AOC ultimately revealed, and, kind of led with some of her family and friends maybe hearing it for the first time, that one of the instances of trauma that she experienced was being a survivor of sexual assault. And so when you think of trauma just compounding over time, and, being more aware of situations due to situations you've been in before. So I'm sure, the response of the Capitol Police officer she was more aware and cognizant of that response, just because it's like, we're in this turbulent time, but the anger that he was projecting was being projected at her, the victim, as opposed to these rioters that were outside. And ultimately, where he told them to go was on the level of where the rioters were just right outside another door. So comes into question of if her safety and best interest was at heart then. And it was a turbulent time also, because you didn't know who you could trust. She wholeheartedly didn't trust most of the Republican alternate members of Congress. One, they weren't wearing masks. Two, they supported this insurrection. It was a traumatic time. I understood where she took the break from social media. But this trauma that compounds over time, and this is not just experiencing it, but it's also healing. And it also is how we treat ourselves, subsequent to that experience, and then over time. And it's also in how we treat others, because, oftentimes you hear hurt people. And so if you're not getting that healing, if if you're not taking that time for yourself, you could end up ultimately projecting it on someone else. So one of the things she did say was that counseling and mental health services were available to them immediately after the insurrection, but just that same night they still went in to to count the votes, I believe. And it was, part of me was like, y'all need to go home and take care of yourselves, be with your family. But then also part of me, after hearing her personal experience, was like, well, I mean, they went through this and they didn't want to feel like, these rioters won, that this is their due diligence and this is what they want to do for the greater number of American people. And I do respect that, and I do appreciate that, especially when the election and every aspect about it itself was teetering on, possibly 4 more years of just nightmarish times. But I say all this to just say, like, you really don't know what people are going through. And yeah, we knew that the insurrection took place. We knew that there were Congress members in there, but I don't think people realize the depth of trauma and the gravity of violence that could have taken place, and the loss of life at even a greater number that could have taken place. And I know it's been a few months since the insurrection, but as we are on the last day of Women's History Month, I think that's something that we really need to think about, just in the span of women having the rights and the capabilities to do things that didn't come until almost a century ago, but also every subsequent step and hurdle and obstacle that we've had to face. And I know that there were male members of Congress targeted, but just the violence that seemed to permeate even more so for the female members of Congress, especially those who are from marginalized groups. So, and obviously AOC being a primary target, and she's obviously a target in the media from Republicans, but like, this could have turned physical. This could have been life altering. And so I think it's important that we really stop and think about what people are dealing with, what people have gone through in just the span of 4 months. I mean, we're almost hitting on April 6th here, not too long, and that will be 3 months. So just keeping that in perspective. And so I've always respected AOC, her intelligence, her bravery, her boldness, that she seeks equality and equity and respect among all groups, all people, the American people, putting them first. I wholeheartedly respect that. And in the face of all the insults and criticism that she receives on a daily, she doesn't let that stop her. And I mean, that's an unfortunate reality, but when you see her speak, when you listen to her speak, like, she just possesses this poise and this confidence that I completely respect and admire. And I just wanted to kind of put it out there that if people didn't see her Instagram story, that I mean, she went through a lot on that day and that evening, and subsequently, clearly still healing. But I think it's important to know the full scope of a person and what makes them. And a lot of times trauma that we experience over the course of years, decades, whatnot, does help shape us, and how we handle that trauma and heal from it also shapes us. And I, unfortunately that she's dealt with that, but she has grown and been shaped into a beautiful, professional woman that I wholeheartedly admire. So as we end Women's History Month, obviously, just like Black History Month, it's not a 1 month thing. It's, the acknowledgement for that specific month, but ultimately you want to keep in mind these historic events, these monumental events that have changed the course of the world, changed the course of the country, by Black people, by Indigenous people, by women. And that's not a 1 month thing. That is an everyday thing, but definitely highlighted in certain months. So just take that with you. Keep in mind, you don't know what someone else's story. They may not know yours. It's up to you whether you want to reveal it. But ultimately, that respect should be there for someone else, no matter whether you know their story or not. Take care. Keep your heads up. Obviously, the Derek Chauvin trial is currently going on for George Floyd's murder. So there's going to be a lot of turbulent news and happenings. So just keep your head up, stay strong, and as always, justice for Breonna Taylor. Peace.